Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to read ahead in chapter 11. If you didn't, I'm going to read some of it just for time's sake. Not going to read all of it, but I'm going to talk about all of it. It's 36 verses long, so it's kind of on the longer side of the chapters that Paul has been going through in his letter to the Romans. Um, as I was reading through, and obviously most of our Bibles have these titles at the beginning of every chapter, and even kind of titles within chapters. My chapter 11 in my version, which is the New Living Translation, is titled God's Mercy on Israel. And as I read through the chapter, and I've always been taught, okay, those headings are put there by other people, but how would I think or title this chapter? And certainly God's mercy on Israel is an appropriate title for this chapter, but the way I thought of it is to the extent that Romans is Paul making a case for Christ, really, to the Gentile-led church in Rome. This is a pivot chapter in many respects because he's pulling back for a second and saying, metaphorically saying, you probably have some questions developing based on everything I've just said in 1 through 10, or really 1 through 8. And then in 9, 10, and 11, he starts to kind of back up and say, okay, this is going to create some questions in your mind, and I'm going to address those questions now. And that question really has to do with Israel. It's the Israel question. And so if I were to retitle this chapter, I would characterize it as a preemptive rebuttal to the Israel question. And so when I say a preemptive rebuttal, a lot of you know, so as Chris just mentioned, professionally, I'm an attorney, and as a prosecutor, when I'm prosecuting a case and presenting it to the jury, I'm constantly having to think of, okay, what questions are the jurors developing in their minds that they need me to answer before I sit down? And so it's incumbent upon us to address those questions or take the legs out of the defense argument before the defense even has a chance to get up and give their argument and anticipate what their argument might be, or the counter argument might be, or what is my rebuttal, and I'm going to give it before I even have to rebut anything. And that's really what Paul's doing here to the church in Rome. So 1 through 9, as we've been hearing, he's making a case or explaining to the Romans that, hey, you as the Gentiles, you're part of this. This is for all of us. And at least in my Bible, the way it's organized, it talks about a breakdown of the different chapters, and it characterizes chapters 1 through 3 as the message being, all have sinned. And then chapters 4 and 5, and we are all, Gentiles and Jews, justified by grace through faith rather than works. And so that's his message at this point. We have all sinned. We are all justified by grace through faith as opposed to works. And it's that all. It's all inclusive, all of us, not just the Jews. And so then he gets to chapters 9, 10, and 11, but really 11, where he's pulling back a little bit and saying, okay, now I have to ask the question of, you've heard all along that the Jews are the special chosen people of God. So what about them? Because as you know, a lot of them have rejected Christ as the Messiah. So what happens to them now? And so that's where we are going to get to in this chapter. And so and I've put this in the highlighted portions of the discussion questions on your table. I'm going to kind of identify 3 points that he really makes, or 3 words that we're going to focus on in this discussion. The first one is pride and the lessons thereof and warnings against pride. But not just individual pride. We're going to be talking about kind of groupthink pride, really, or group identity pride, which is a little bit different than some of the pride that has been talked about all throughout the Bible about making ourselves idols and the warnings against that, but making our group think the idol. The second part is God's promises. And does he keep them? Do they change over time? Can we bank on them? And if so, what does that mean for our daily lives? And then third, being in awe of God. And you'll see what I mean when we get to the very end of this chapter where Paul just sits and reflects on what he just said for a moment. All right, so that's kind of where we're going. Just to give a little bit of background for a second, everybody knows this is a pretty lengthy letter. It's Paul's most thorough and orderly presentation of the gospel he wrote. In many of the other books that he's writing, he's tackling specific subjects on a more narrow basis. This is the broad picture of this is the gospel when we talk about Romans. And that makes sense because he's writing it to Rome, which is the epicenter of the modern world at that time. Their citizens have the greatest influence, and what flows out of it carries authority, right? And so he's going to present the whole picture. And so to the extent that his other books are him calling witnesses to build his case, this is his closing argument, this book, so to speak, where he's bringing it all together. So at this point in history where he's writing this, Paul ultimately does 3 missionary journeys over the course of time. He is, at the moment that he's writing this, he's headed back to Jerusalem briefly before he's about to leave for Rome. So this is an anticipatory letter ahead of his arrival in Rome, where he will ultimately go, but he will ultimately be imprisoned, where he will write up a number of his other books, but where he will ultimately also be beheaded. Okay, so we have to kind of keep in mind the context in which this is being written. So this is written in 60 AD or thereabout, which is later in the order of many of his other books, but not his last book because some of those are written from prison in Rome later. And so at this point, there has been several decades of pretty rampant growth and spreading of the gospel. Christ's message that the impact of his sacrifice would be a benefit that extends to all of God's children has been haggled over and debated by Peter and other disciples, as is described in Acts, and now has been preached by Paul and his teammates, for lack of a better word, for a few decades to the Gentiles. So that's kind of where we sit. But what is becoming painfully obvious at this point is that the ruling class of the Jews in Jerusalem, which dictates everything else, or every place else for the Jews, is not coming around to that message. And enough time has passed at this point from which a recognition has to be made that the most fertile ground for the gospel, or the most receptive hearts, are those of the Gentiles at this point, not the Jews, much of which was predicted by Jesus, right? Let's get into chapter 11 here. All right, I'm going to start by reading 1 through 10 because it sets the stage for the rest of the chapter. So verses 1 through 10, and I'm just going to read them so that we can kind of quickly go through this. It says, I ask then, has God rejected his own people, the nation of Israel? Of course not. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham and a member of the tribe of Benjamin. No, God has not rejected his own people, whom he has chosen from the very beginning. Do you realize what the scriptures say about this? Elijah the prophet complained to God about the people of Israel and said, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. And do you remember God's reply? He said, "No, I have 7,000 others who have never bowed down to Baal." It is the same today, for a few of the people of Israel have remained faithful because of God's grace, his undeserved kindness in choosing them. And since it is through God's kindness, then it is not by their good works. For in that case, God's grace would not be what it really is, free and undeserved. So this is the situation. Most of the people of Israel have not found the favor of God they are looking for so earnestly. A few have, the ones God has chosen, but the hearts of the rest were hardened. And it goes on to cite some Old Testament passages that predicted that. All right, so 1 through 10, Paul's really saying, okay, on this Israel question about what's going to happen to the Jews, my first point is that the rejection of Christ by the Jews is not universal. Some have come to faith, and they have come to faith the same way you Gentiles have, which is by grace through faith, not by their works, not by the law that they've been following for so long, not by their disciplined behaviors, but by grace through faith in Christ. And so not all of them have rejected. So first of all, he wants to clear that up, and he does. And he makes the point of, for instance, I myself, Paul, am an Israelite, a prior persecutor of Christians, and I came to faith through Christ, and therefore it's possible for all Jewish people to do so. And in verse 6, he really re-emphasizes that that the Jews also have to come to faith through grace. They don't get an exemption by following the law. They are just like the rest of us. All right, so then we get to that next bulk of chapters, or verses 11 through 21. Again, I'm not going to read all of those, but I want to read enough of it to get a sense of the topic that he's introducing or the question that he's addressing, because he starts it the same way he started 1. He says, he asks a question and then answers his own question. Did God's people stumble and fall beyond recovery? Of course not. Just as he frames the issue and then answers it right out of the gate, and then he offers support for that conclusion. So, did God's people stumble? God's people meaning the Jews here, and fall beyond recovery? Of course not. In other words, are they never coming back? Are they never going to understand that Christ was the Messiah? And what is his answer? A resounding no. They will someday. And then he starts to talk about how that's going to work. They were disobedient, so God made salvation available to the Gentiles. But he wanted his own people to become jealous and claim it for themselves. Now, if the Gentiles were enriched because the people of Israel turned down God's offer of salvation, think how much greater a blessing the world will share when they finally accept it. I am saying all this especially for Gentiles. God has appointed me as the apostle to the Gentiles. I stress this, for I want somehow to make the people of Israel jealous of what you Gentiles have, so I might save some of them. For since their rejection meant that God offered salvation to the rest of the world, their acceptance will be even more wonderful. It will be life for those who were dead. And since Abraham and the other patriarchs were holy, their descendants will also be holy. Just as the entire batch of dough is holy, because the portion given as an offering is holy. For if the roots of the tree are holy, the branches will be too. All right. So, and then it goes on a little further, and it talks about kind of the grafting of an olive tree and the grafting of a wild olive branch onto a decaying tree. And he's obviously using that analogy of bringing the Jews, bringing the Gentiles, which are the wild olive branch, and grafting it onto a decaying olive tree to cause it to bear fruit again, to bring it back to life. And so that's the analogy that he goes on to use in verses 17 through 21 there. So, what is he saying here? He's saying, well, I know you must be wondering, what about the rest of Israel? Those who have not accepted Christ as the Messiah. What's going to happen to them? What's going to happen to those Jews who refuse to believe in Christ? And he says that God overruled the Jewish belief that the Gentiles could never share in the gospel privileges. So the Jews had always believed that as the chosen people of God, as the children of God, they were special unto themselves, and there was an exclusivity there. There was a special designation for them as a nation, as a people of a certain faith, as a birthright, as an ethnicity, as a governmental entity as well. So the nation of Israel is a multifaceted type of thing, and still is, right? I mean, this is timely, and always has been. This issue has been at the crux of a lot of world history, hasn't it? And it's never stopped from prior to this point in Romans to the present day. All right. So, how does he answer that question? What about the rest of Israel, those who have rejected Christ as the Messiah? First of all, he points out that the Jewish pride in being chosen led to God choosing to allow the Gentiles to also be reconciled to himself. So us having access to or being brought in, and my understanding is that this was all in part of God's plan, but in the sense that he knew how this was going to play out. But the way he describes it here is that was the result of, in part, the Jews rejecting Christ. That opened up the Gentiles' access to being made right by God, as John and Chris talked about, and in previous weeks. All right. So I'm going to editorialize here for a moment on this issue, and this gets dangerous. But when I think of the practical application of this explanation of what about the Jews and in our lives, and I hear Paul talking about it was their pride that brought them down. It was the pride in their group identification, in their group think, in their own sense of specialness, better than. It's the us versus them, right? That he's talking about, and I think he is warning all of us. Specifically, he's talking to the newer church in Rome at this point, but he's warning all of us that making idols out of our group identities is a dangerous path. Throughout the Bible, we are warned against idol worship, right? Whether that's an individual person other than Christ. But here he's talking about beware of making idols out of the group that you choose to belong to, whether that's your ethnicity. Can you imagine how the world history would be different if we didn't make idols out of our identification with a race or ethnic group? But also, it may be a reprimand or a warning of making idols out of causes that we devote ourselves to. And I'm not saying don't give to causes or devote yourself to causes that you believe in. But it's really a warning about keep them in their proper perspective and place in our lives. Don't put them on the throne instead of Christ. So ethnicity, race, causes, even our professions. Sometimes we can become identified as a pastor or an attorney or a prosecutor or whatever. And everybody has their different thing. Sometimes it's our last names, our family identities, that we're capable of putting that up on the throne sometimes. And we have to be careful of that. There's a million different things that we can become identified with. And this is this is where it gets dangerous. It's not lost on me that I'm also saying this on Super Tuesday. Right? And I'm not saying that we don't get involved in politics or something like that. We just have to be careful of it becoming the throne, right? So I think the broader message here is there are dangers of the us versus them mentality, whatever that looks like. And the Jews were suffering the consequences of that groupthink that became their throne. The better than mentality. All right. So in sum, he's saying that pride is incompatible with gratitude, and gratitude is at the heart of salvation through grace. You can't experience grace without the gratitude of understanding what Christ did for us, right? And then I also think this grafting analogy that he uses, where he's combining the Gentile faith with the old, the Israel faith, or the Jews, also probably sends a message of a healthy body of any Christians will include those knowledgeable and experienced in the faith, who've been walking for a long time and experienced the ups and downs of that, with those newer to the faith, who can provide that energy and that freshness of perspective and excitement and fire that comes with a new revelation in your life. And it is through that grafting of those two things, the old and the new, that causes a church to bear fruit. And so that is why it's so important that we keep reaching out to our community, and that we not become insular in who is among our group. And I really say that for myself more than anything, because I became a Christian in 19. I'm 54 now. There are times as you just walk the long walk that there are going to be ruts. There are going to be laziness, for lack of a better word. And I know I need some infusion of some new life and new blood. And I need to be grafted onto. Not that I'm decaying, but I need that re-energizing. And I think I'm probably not alone in that. All right, so then in verses 22 through 32, I'm going to kind of go through those a little quicker because I really want to get to 33 through 36. But in 22 through 32, Paul is cautioning the Gentiles now against pride and looking down on the Jews for their unbelief. So he initially says this pride by the Jews was their downfall. And now he's switching gears and saying, okay, Gentiles, don't fall into the same trap as you go forward. Don't look down on the Jews for their unbelief. Don't you think you're better than them, just as they used to think, or just as they do think they are better than you. This pride is a two-way street. And so to the extent that you need to learn from their falls, you need to also not think of yourselves as better than. But then he goes on to say, and that's in part because Israel will be brought back into God's covenant again. And he goes on to talk about their rejection of the gospel, the Jews' rejection of the gospel, and their indignation at it being preached to the Gentiles caused God to view some of them as enemies, meaning some of the Jewish people. But his love for their fathers, and he mentions them by name, the Abraham and the Jacob and the Isaac, but his love for their fathers will ultimately be remembered. this final mercy and restoration of the Jews is intended for them and shows God's patience and love for those he originally called. Okay, so to the extent that the question began with what's going to happen with the Jews, the answer here is ultimately, someday, they will be restored through Christ. We don't know when that is. Has it happened yet? No, not necessarily. Has it happened in fits and spurts? Sometimes. But the nation as a whole ultimately will, and that's part of God's promise, and it's an outcropping of his love for the patriarchs of the Jewish faith. And so to the extent that we cling to that idea that every knee will bow and every tongue confess someday, that's going to include the Jewish nation, or the nation of Israel, is his promise here. Okay, so then he gets to 33, and it's like Paul pulls back for a second and sits and reflects. And I'm going to read this. He says, "Oh, how great are God's riches and wisdom and knowledge. How impossible it is for us to understand his decisions and his ways." In other words, Paul's saying, I don't know how all this is going to work out. At some level, it's still a mystery to me too, is what Paul's saying when it comes to the Jews, my people. But what does he follow that question or mystery statement with? Then he says, "For who can know the Lord's thoughts? Who knows enough to give advice? And who has been given and who has given him so much that he needs to pay it back?" And this is how he wraps it up. "For everything comes from him and exists by his power and is intended for his glory. All glory to him forever." In other words, God is God. Some things are mysteries. I, as Paul, the author of a good chunk of the book that we rely on to explain the world to us, is saying some things I just don't get, right? We have to be humble enough to say the same thing to him. So I don't know how this is going to work out. But what I do know is God is God. And what I do know are some of his attributes, which is wisdom, goodness, justice is what he's talking about here. And what he's ultimately saying is, and I know he will keep his covenants and continue to pursue us, whom he has called. So he's sitting down, humbly reflecting on the state of his people in all this. And that's what he just has to cozy in on, is God is God. He keeps his promises. He is just, he is good, and he's kind. And so at the end of the day, that's what I have to bank on. It's a pretty cool thought for us who don't have all the answers to, right? So with that, I did put just three groups of discussion questions premised on those three concepts that I just talked about: pride, promises, and how do we get to a place where we have that perpetual sense of awe of God that Paul has. So, chat about those, and thank you guys.